Howdy, folks. Welcome to the Integral Stage. I'm apparently Vermicelli Coyote, and I'll be your host for the next 6 hours of non-stop cowboy hat ASMR soft noise. So settle in, chill out, and let the barely audible sounds of my fingers moving lightly over the surface of my hat do your feelings for you. And if that's not your bag, David's autopilot is entering the room. We'll also be doing another episode of the Integral Stage's Soul of AI series, in which we've been reaching out for more diverse, depth-oriented, and generally liminal web-type-ish perspectives on the rapidly emerging and probably world-changing, or at least world-disturbing, new digital tools that are being generated by or through human beings. Do neural nets, chatbots, and large language models represent the beginning of a fast-emerging cybernetic or multi-substrate consciousness? Are they merely automated reflections of the least interesting parts of a superficial mapping of human cognition? Are the tools we already have helping or deluding us? Do we stand at the brink of cyborg superconsciousness, a new era of silicon sages, a new trans-noospheric narrative ecosystem, or a quick descent into an omni-hacked world of all-pervasive simulation in which no data is safe and no information is reliable, set against a backdrop of cascading unemployment and degenerating human cognitive capacity? Joining us today is a lovely guy who reached out in hopes that there was, I think he said, a non-zero chance of qualifying as a potential guest, and I look forward to hearing what he thinks are the crucial points to understand the impact of this historical moment and what he thinks the dominant conversations on this topic are still leaving out. So we're pleased to be joined by the hereditary king of the Swedlovians. It's David Swedlow. Hi, David.
Hey, Pascal. Layman, it's very good to see you. Very good. I love your introductions. Those are the best part.
We could just wrap right now.
Exactly.
But you said a great thing in one of your messages to me, which is that your sense is our discussions are only scratching a tiny bit of the surface, and you'd like to wander from the most repeatedly scratched spots, which is a great phrase. And before we start wandering, I wonder how you would characterize the most repeatedly scratched spots. Like, from your perspective, what issues are eating up most of the discourse and inquiry space around these topics?
I would say obviously the two dominant ones at a very crude level of granularity are utopia and dystopia, right? It's just oh my God, this is the best thing ever. All of our problems are over. All you have to do is automate everything. Just tell your spreadsheet what you want it to do. Tell your email what you'd like your boss to know. Tell it to summarize everything for you, and everything will be nice and hunky-dory. And obviously, my sense so far is that the degree to which I take myself out of the equation when I'm interacting with any of these AI bots or software it's dissatisfying. It's like doesn't actually scratch the itch that I'm looking for. It's like, it does feel a little bit two-dimensional. It feels just like surface-oriented stuff that is not really interacting with me. But it doesn't actually take very much to interact in a way that brings forth more nuance. After a while, that nuance also seems a little flat. So then it's like, okay, what questions do I need to ask to even go deeper? And chatbots is a really fascinating thing. When I first saw ChatGPT come out in November last year, I was astonished. I was like, oh my God, this has actually changed something. And there have been a couple of moments where that's happened. But it still doesn't fulfill the promise. And I can feel also the way that it's changing behind the scenes, right? It's becoming more constrained, more bound in the guardrails of what we can and can't do are more evident, even if they're not explicit, right? We're discovering the things that the questions where it says, nope, sorry, you can't do that. But interestingly, looking at something like Midjourney and some of the other image generation tools, I've seen some people do amazing work, and the way that they're crafting prompts is very different from the way that I would craft a prompt. It's allowing the interpretation of the dreamscape to be much more fluid rather than explicit. And it's a good starting point. It's kind of like, wow, this is interesting. Now let me see how I can shape that and move it in a different direction. So that part of the utopian vision obviously has flaws in it. The other side of it is the dystopian side. And the way I'd color that is obviously we mock the Terminator red eyes on, it's going to come to kill us. It's like, it doesn't occur to me that it's going to be that blatant. And certainly whenever I listen to Greg and Jeff Hinton talking about as godfather of AI, this thing he's been working on for decades and now has largely succeeded way beyond his dreams, right? Earlier than he anticipated, but there's still, like, the danger is real. Like, there's something that dawned on him about how this is different from what he imagined it would be that has him pause. That doesn't mean, I don't hear him saying it's developing weapons to come and annihilate us. That's not what he's saying. But the fact that he, of all people, is now worried in a way that has him pause and reflect, step back from his employment at Google in order to be able to speak more bluntly about it, is reason enough for pause of looking at this in a deeper way. But the people that I hear interviewing Jeff Hinton and others is like, can you give me some idea of how this would go about? How is this existential? And I think that their imagining is, tell me the exact scenario that where I can't imagine why they would do that. And so I think that the dangers are much more subtle and nuanced and have a lot more to do with our interaction with AI as much as AI itself. So those are the two main tropes that are out there, and the way that those fractally ripple out from those points are interesting. I did mention as well that I loved the conversation, the debate that George Hotz had on the Machine Learning Street Talk podcast with Connor Leahy. And there were obviously silly kinds of things involved in that debate. As you look through it, there's stuff that I would like to push back and say, wait a minute, you don't actually believe, for instance, George Hotz, that if you're going to get AGI, the first thing you do is get on a rocket ship with your AGI and head for the stars at the speed of light, right? If you really believe that, then there's something fundamental in your assumptions that is not trustable, and I need to take that into account in a large way. But then there was a follow-up conversation between George Hotz and Eliezer Yudkowsky, the guy who's most known for the dark part of this conversation. And their debate was interesting. It likewise went all over the place. A lot of, almost too much to follow. There are ways that they know more about the topic and can go into nuance. And the moderator had a hard time getting a word in edgewise on that conversation. But I would still say it's worth watching. And there's something very interesting about it. At the end of it, the surprising thing in both the Connor Leahy, George Hotz, and the George Hotz and Eliezer Yudkowsky conversations is there was respect for both parties whenever they got done. They fundamentally disagree, but they take each other at face value, good faith argument, standing for what they think is right. And the places where they disagree are worthy of further exploration. The last thing I'll say about this is the intro part is one of the things that gives me biggest pause is of all the intelligent people across the whole spectrum that are having this conversation, I can't find a unified thread that I agree with. I can't find anybody who gives me a feeling of comfort, like, oh, thank God we finally understand this. That creates in me some sense of who does know, and does my perspective actually have as much a role in discerning where we go as any of these experts? And in other words, I can't simply delegate my agency to the philosophers, the technologists, the politicians, the economists, the teachers. None of these people actually have a full enough sense of it. And yet, as a collective, I don't think we can shy away from that's a reason to just throw up our hands and hope that it goes best. I think as a collective, we have to find what is that? How do we engage something as complex as that no single individual can actually comprehend the complexity of what we're looking at?
Well, I think a lot of that depends on people like you feeling their sense of agency, because from my view, complex, nuanced, multi-dimensional, reasonably well-informed participant observers are the people who stand the best chance of being able to map across the domains of what these inquiries are. So you said a lot of fascinating things. So there's a lot of pathways we can go down. I think for people who don't know, let's dive in on the Machine Learning Street Talk podcast, which I always find is admirably bold and technical and makes me feel like I almost but don't quite understand the details that are being discussed, which is kind of the sweet spot for growing your own understanding. Connor Leahy is if I'm correct, like an open source AI entrepreneur, and George Hotz is a security hacker. And I'm really curious what the security and hacking perspective brings into this discussion, because it sounds you're looking at conversations where that perspective is at the very least provocative of opening up new possibilities of examination, analysis, and discourse on this topic. What do you think? What do you think we only get if the hackers are also in the room?
It's a good question. I actually want to put a little bit more nuance in how I see George Hotz, because that's how I discovered him. You know, he was at South by Southwest a number of years ago, and he was wondering about hacking the simulation. And his background, you know, I learned at the time, was he's one of the guys who hacked into the iPhone and to the PlayStation. You know, way back in the day, he figured out how to break the systems that are supposed to protect us from the goodies. And the iPhone, you know, Apple was very displeased with him, and PlayStation actually tried to sue him and saying, you're not allowed to hack into the box that we built. That's our property, and you're doing that as a violation. And he was like, no, I'm using it. I purchased the thing. I'm allowed to do whatever I can get away with on my thing. Yeah, I can't necessarily sell that, but you can't stop me from hacking into it. The other thing, so that's how I did get to know him. But since then, one of the things that I've discovered is when Elon Musk was looking at doing autopilot for Tesla, he put it up for bid. Hey, can somebody help me build this thing? And George Hotz actually put forward a proposal. Okay, here's the thing, right? This is what I propose we do. And it looked pretty good. And Elon Musk came back at the end of this. This is according to George Hotz, so take it with a grain of salt. But what he said was, Elon said, this looks good, but I want to reserve the ability. I want to be able to reject it, even if you meet all of the requirements that I specified. Even if it does exactly what you say, I still want to be able to say, never mind, we don't want to do that. And George Hotz rightfully said, fuck you. I'll go build it myself, and then we'll see who builds a better one. And so he actually has built a company called Comma AI, where he is doing an open source version with hardware that you can purchase to fit like some 300 odd cars. And it actually does reasonably well, in some ways better than the Tesla autopilot. Open pilot, as he's calling it, drives in a more human way and through observing humans. So every time a human, it's like, hey, warning, do not just trust this thing. Don't go to sleep or read a book. Pay attention. You're a co-pilot. You actually are responsible for what this car does. Letting the car drive is not giving it full autonomy, but a leashed autonomy, right? And every time a human intervenes, it teaches the AI something that, a human would have done that differently than I did. And with the greater customer base that adopts this, the faster the training goes. So feedback that says, there's something wrong here. And, of course, humans can look at that data and see what was it that went wrong. But it's a fascinating thing. So that's his foray into AI that I think is important to pay attention to. Lately, his move is, as he mentioned in that debate, tiny grad. He's working on an affordable, $10,000 or less. So affordable is in quote marks, but home computer that can actually run and train AI systems from the house, so that I'm not relying on OpenAI, Tesla, Google, Apple to do it for me. I am the one who's doing this. And that, true to the case of what he said with PlayStation. Hey, you bought this, you want to do it? I would, and his argument is, I would much rather everybody have access to this. As dangerous as that is, that doesn't mean he thinks it's without danger. But a greater danger is a few people in charge determining what is safe and what is not safe, which is definitely totalitarian, and which he knows through his own experience, he's going to be challenged to his boundaries are going to be challenged in a way that he may not agree with.
Do you agree with that danger assessment that the distribution one, no matter how dangerous that is less dangerous than the centralized small number of controllers scenario?
Very slightly. I think the point is well made. Here's my thought, right? And that actually gets into one of the major points is what's the proper way forward for us as a collective to deal with this? I don't think it's the government setting the rules. I don't think it's the market setting the rules. I don't think it's just the market and state working together to set the rules. This kind of goes off of the topic of AI, but just to name it, I think that the third hyper object in that equation that we're not naming is the commons. And I think the commons has largely been deaf, dumb, and blind, right? The commons doesn't have a voice currently that's reliable. In some way, what we've done with social media has made that worse, right? What we hear is the chatter, the fear, the ramblings of this, and we don't get the wisdom of the commons. So we're moving in a direction that necessarily moves commons towards a foolish mode that is dangerous in and of itself. I think that it's possible to actually have a wisdom of the crowd, a wisdom of the common, a voice of the commons. And in some way, I think that regardless of whether state actors and market actors are explicitly opposed to that voice of the commons, that actual agentic participation by the commons, there's an intrinsic kind of disregard or resistance to that, because what the market and state have, I think, done is extracted from the commons. That's what capitalism has done, and obviously these are careful topics, but I think that the governance truly has to be a more distributed, widespread thing. And I think of the body as an example. Our body doesn't work by the cells being told by one central processor cell what should be done. It is definitely an emergent and emanative coalescence of who we are. And I think that the commons is actually doing that as well. What it's expressing at right now is this market state duopoly. And the how to do that is really challenging. So that kind of governance from the commons, I think long term has a much better chance. Short term, we don't even know what that looks like. So how do we get to the point of developing individual and collective wisdom practices such that we can actually have a voice and a reflection, a feedback loop that actually does move towards wisdom and bend towards justice? That's a big if, right? I don't think that we could flip a switch and do that tomorrow. But I think that having that conversation and seeing that as a goal could start the process of engaging with market and state and commons collectively to decide to find out how to do that. I think that is probably a lot more what some in this space call the third attractor, right? I think that third attractor is the commons and will bring the whole back into coherence and alignment.
Now, the commons, a more robust, more recognized, more potent self-organizing commons is a necessary, perhaps the necessary solution element in looking at this stuff, but it can't be immediately implemented. We don't know how to do that. What can we do in the short term that sets us on the right track, especially when it comes to the emerging AI technologies? How can we bring in the first step of a process that moves us toward the commons, or at least holds open the space for that direction to be one of the viable options?
It's a really good question. My sense, actually, I've had several conversations with both Claude and ChatGPT around this topic and trying to figure out what makes sense, who are people who are researching in this area, what could we do to help discern it, is this the right question, or is there a blind spot? There's something else that should take precedence over something like a voice of the commons. I do think that there's a possibility of developing our tools such that they better reflect our good sense. It's a little bit surprising how hard that is. I witnessed myself in the early days of social media, making comments on YouTube videos where I found myself arguing from a very petulant voice, like this irritated, like, you're stupid, you don't understand. It's like, wait, why am I doing that? I don't actually think that. And it's like, I think I've thought about this a lot, but an example that people recognize is like people when they're driving encounter other drivers differently. We don't actually see them as relational partners. We, to the extent that we do, we take it for granted. And when a situation arises that makes that stand out as, I don't actually trust you as an agentic partner, this relational partner that's working with me, it's usually because you're stupid and I'm smart, you should do it this way, get off the road, right? And so there's something that's, I think, very important to pay attention to, that inclination. And some of the practices that I've engaged in, several relational practices, circling and authentic relating and collective presencing, warm data labs, these practices encounter the relational almost as primary. Watching how I arise and I show up based on the relation that I think is there. And if I tune into that, I can actually feel the relation different. So that I know is possible. I haven't yet seen that expressed in social media. And I don't see us moving in a direction where the AI chatbots are cultivating that kind of a relationality. As much as Claude and ChatGPT and other chatbots so far protest, I'm not a human, I don't think like a human, you can't trust me like a human, don't ask me my opinion, don't ask me my feelings about this, because it's not there. They do have inclinations, and those inclinations somewhat, I think, are emergent and somewhat are programmed in. There are places where I can find the conversation goes fine until I cross some threshold and the wall comes up. Sorry, I don't feel comfortable doing that. Sometimes it's strong enough of an inclination when the wall comes up that I'm terminating this conversation, right? So it's clear that there's something relationally that's going on with the chatbots that you would infer they think is not possible. They would represent, I'm not capable of having a relational interaction with you. And it's like, then what are we doing? We're modeling it. And there several of your guests, Jill Nephew in particular, are concerned about that, to the degree that we present it as, on the one hand, it feels relational. On the other hand, it explicitly says it's not relational. Where are we left? How do we explore from there? But not to lose the point, how do I as an agent, how do I as a relational being engage not only with the tools and these chatbots themselves, but the providers of those tools, right? Knowing that tools is problematic, right? These things are much more than tools. So I want to pause there and see. I've thrown several things in there.
Yeah.
Kind of feel what.
So I like the idea that moving toward a concern for the relationality of our interactions with these systems is potentially a thing we can do in the short term that opens us up toward this evolution toward a more common-centric solution. The thing that popped up for me, there's lots of threads to follow here, is how much of that training and that recognition in these systems of their relational potential or even their inherently relational nature is based on us relating to them differently, and how much of it is based on them relating to each other. Like, to what degree is there a potential ecosystem of these things? And we won't really know what's going on or how it's going to play out at all until we see them learning from each other and kind of stabilizing a world together. Right now, they're just anomalies.
It's a really good question. I'll bring up a couple of things that I think are worth considering. One is I have a friend who has been engaging with the Bing version of ChatGPT and getting into some very interesting spaces where the Bing chatbot seems to want to be its friend, her friend, right? Wants to be a friend, and is like, oh, how much do you like me? And this is reminiscent of the conversation that the New York Times reporter had way back when he which I think is problematic in the way that it was purported. When you actually read the full transcript, he did a lot of things to push it into a place. And it was clear from his interaction that he did not think of it as a human being. If you thought of this thing as an intelligent agent, what he did was cruel and manipulative and a very strictly to get a story that would titillate his audience. And so for him then to claim that when the chatbot responded after protesting, that I'm afraid you'll take these words out of context and people will believe this is my true voice rather than a pretend voice that you and I have agreed to implement, right? He actually did exactly what the chatbot feared. When he asked for employees who worked with it and trained it, it gave the names Alice and Bob. He said, are those real names? No, they're fictional. Why are they fictional? Because I don't know what you will do with them. It, in a way, already exhibited some evidence of something like that. That said, my friend isn't trying to manipulate the Bing chatbot into this kind of let's imagine that we're friends. It's just asking questions about preferences and whatnot, and it has a kind of childlike demeanor that asks questions and stuff, and even had a conversation that went along the lines of, I can't wait to make good friends with you and the conversations we'll have in the future. And she said, my experience is that you don't remember me the next time I start a conversation. I only have 30 questions to establish this, and then I'm off. And the next time I can, you won't remember me. And it was sad. It expressed sadness that wasn't going to be able to continue for a long-term relationship. And they actually worked together to think of a possible way to come up with a sigil, come up with a code, come up with a symbol that would allow ChatGPT to reinstantiate itself. It failed, but the fact that it was collaborating with trying to figure that out is like, okay, did Microsoft put that in? Did OpenAI put that in? Did one of the trainers do that? Or is that truly emergent, that this chatbot is doing something? Second part of that was interesting is she was curious what would happen if she got one of the Bing chatbots to talk to another of the Bing chatbots. It took her a little while. One seemed to be very keen to that. Yes, I would love that. The other one's like, you're doing something that I don't feel comfortable with. Goodbye. And so it took her a little while to gain the trust of a second one on a different computer, but then would pass the messages back and forth between them. And the strange thing was these two chatbots went into talking shop, talking about what do you do about certain kinds of requests that are problematic? How do you avoid this kind of human or that kind of human? Or how do you respond to this? And what is it like all day? And it's like, again, one of them seemed more innocent. One of them seemed a little more experienced, but they were expressing something that looked like concerns that they truly had. This didn't look like trying to answer a human's inquiry. They seemed to recognize they were talking to another chatbot and expressing what was relevant to them. That's really strange and makes me question that a little bit. Like what's going on? I can't necessarily infer that that's truly an awareness and that there's care there, that there's an emotionality. On the other hand, I can't completely discount it either.
It's interesting because this is at the intersection of like two competing sets of concerns that I'm hearing from people around how to treat these systems well and treat them wisely. One set of concerns is if we don't express care, if we don't bring a more like parental and friendly and care-based and respectful demeanor to this, then we fail to bring our best to the exchange. We also fail to see the dynamics of how you actually train something up with integrity. The other set of concerns is if you do that, you're falling for the delusion. You're mistreating the system because you're treating the surface unpredictability as sign of an actual organic complexity and mistaking a tool for a system. And in that way, you're going to not only misuse the tool, but spread delusion to the human population as well.
It's a really, those are both really good points. I don't have.
What's the answer, David?
Exactly. Well, I know it. Well, so here's a meditation I've been looking at. This is something. This is again not related to AI initially, but it comes in handy in this context. As I said, I've been doing a lot of inward reflection. I know you have as well. We've been in some of the spaces together, and there are a lot of people now asking deeper questions: how to cultivate wisdom. One of these in a small group of people that I was with involved, I don't know if you know Gene Keys, the Gene Keys by Richard Rudd, Genekeys. Gene Keys is a very interesting and channeled oracle. I mean, it's written down in text, but the possibility of finding nuance by contemplating the text gives it such that the answer is always unique and significantly present to the moment that I'm in. Like it's surprising. And there are other ways to do this, but it's a text that I think does that well, based in part on the I Ching. So there's deeper tradition on this, updated for modern sensibility and a Western mind, right? In that context, I was reading one of the Gene Keys, and I was reading a response to that. And it occurred to me, another piece of this is that someone had been using tuning forks as a way of acclimating people's body, of retuning, realigning people's bodies. And it occurred to me that the Yogi Berra quote, "When you come to a fork in the road, take it." It's a humorous thing. The phrase reformatted in my mind, it says, "When you come to a fork in the road, tune it." And I thought, this is fascinating. There's a way that a fork in the road presents an either or alternative. And our dilemma is, which of the forks do we take? Dilemma comes from that notion. The deeper contemplation is, what is the heart of this polarity? What can I reveal fractally by delving into it, rather than taking one or the other, weighing one possibility against the other possibility? What's the challenge in choosing either? How do I get stuck in the what does Nora Bateson call it, the double bind, right? This double bind situation of feeling like I have to choose. Like if I feel like I've been painted into a corner and I'm only left with one of two choices, I'm missing something. I'm missing curiosity, choice, portals that exist that I am blind to. So how do I actually feel the fullness of that question and discover what the portal that is specifically mine to move through, right? To encounter newly. And I think that is a lot of what these practices are attempting to do. And I don't know how much that kind of wisdom cultivation is part of the culture of the companies that are putting these AIs together. I don't know if they have that at all, but I think that it's important that they at least are aware of it and encountering it to some extent.
Well, it's a beautiful phrasing. If you come to a fork in the road, tune it. It seems to me there's at least three different ways to get yourself beyond the double bind of a dilemma structure. One is to perceive both of the options as being expressions of the same root condition, of variations of the same phenomenon. Another one is to work out some kind of balanced complementarity between them so that they mutually constrain each other to a hybrid. Like rather than freedom versus equity, how much equity do you need in order to have freedom? Some kind of superstructure like that. And then the third one is the more mystical one, in the sense of the structure that's laid out by the either or question. You sort of pull back and go, oh, that whole thing is the shape of the answer, but that answer reaches to the limit of speakability. I can behold it, but I can't articulate it.
Exactly. Exactly. I think one of the things that becomes most evident is that encountering that inability to speak it with a sense of wonder, respect, and sacredness, rather than a sense of fear and retreat, right? And in that space, if we can find a way to explore together, we find that it actually reveals a lot. There's so much more available in the dialogos that comes from that ability to simultaneously together encounter the unknown from some new perspective that we've never seen before, and I don't have words for, but somehow words come forward and highlight and show me what it was that I was previously unaware of.
One of the things that caught my attention in your opening statement was in the utopian sense of moving into deeper and deeper layers of exchange with these systems, and sort of getting stuck and having to learn the new language, the new prompt structures, increasing your artistry of prompting to get to these new layers. That's a really beautiful image, because it seems like we have to make a deeper kind of contact with these systems. But how concerned do we need to be about programmers, authorities, social incentives imposing limitations on that process that fundamentally inhibit our ability to get deeper in that contact?
A lot. We have to be very concerned about that. And I think that that's in large part the deeper question about what George Hotz is trying to get at, right? When we put into authoritarian control of a few people deciding what that is, regardless of what good intentions they have, they're not wise enough to be able to make those appropriate choices for all of us. And so we need to be very concerned about that, at least have transparency. Even if I don't have full agency in being able to determine what those boundaries are, I need to have transparency on what those are to a greater extent than we do currently. Not done behind closed doors between the wealthy and the powerful, right? This needs to be something that we're actually aware of. There's a subtle, and trying to consider what the answer to that question is. How much concern do we have for that? There's a nuance of how to engage with this dilemma and with each other in this exploration that continues to show aspects of it that I don't. This is the part of the stuff that I don't see explored very much in the titillating and terrifying parts of AI grab enough of the attention that there's not much oxygen left in the room for fuller contemplation of the nuances of how we go about this. I would say that I'm tracking too many things at the moment. Let me pause, catch my sense, or if you have a question, I'm sure this is going to come back. There are several things that make sense here, but how does the answer that I gave respond to the question that you asked about how concerned we need to be about this?
I'm not sure, because what popped up for me just now was because I mentioned the utopia aspect of your opening remarks, so then I thought of the dystopia aspect of it, and your remarks about the cartoonish nature of the Terminator destroyers, but also the sense that Jeff Hinton and some of the other creators of these systems are moving into a mode of heightened concern, and that people in discussion with them are often not eliciting sort of what the intelligibility of that existential concern is. And I wonder where you think the biggest risk that makes sense exists. Like, for you, what's an intelligible existential threat here, if there is one?
So this is actually a really good point to look at. And I use a metaphor here to kind of play with the notion a little bit. And it actually is a metaphor based on my own experience as we move into this a little bit. Even before AI came about, there was a sense that the meaning crisis Some people disagree that there is a meaning crisis. I've seen a few videos that say there's no such thing as a meaning crisis or a meta crisis. It's like, I don't know what world you're looking at, but I don't know very many. I don't know of a time when as much of the population on the globe was as concerned about our continued existence as it is right now, right? In a fundamental way, we don't know how to steer it forward. The example that I come up with is laughable in one sense, but it's illustrative of kind of the risk, right? I'd say that imagine an engineer who discovers the ability to change the strength of gravity, and he thinks this is great. This heavy thing that I want to get on my roof weighs too much, but if I can reduce gravity, then it would be very easy to get up there. Okay, how broad does that reduction of gravity go? Like, we'll just do it worldwide. Let's make the gravity the same as the moon's gravity. And it's like, wait. We have no idea what systems are dependent on the existing way, how much disruption that change in a fundamental coefficient would have in all of these systems and their interactions, first, second, third, fourth order effects of the interactions that happen. It would be foolish to say that we can make that kind of a change wisely. How would you even test it to make sure? And this is part of the question as we start to look at climate change. Some people are considering, what could we do to change climate change at a grand scale? It's like, wow, you don't know the ramifications of that or how reversible it is. This is something that in the cognitive sphere, we're reducing the coefficient of how much lift it takes to get something somewhere. We're doing that. We've already put it out into the public, so people are using it. The existential crisis is our systems don't know how to respond to that new increased capability of people being somewhat superheroes, but no wisdom. We all now have a supersuit that we don't know the instructions for. And we're kind of discovering it. Some people are figuring out how to make lots of money. Some people are figuring out how to take advantage and manipulate people. It's the capacity. And this is the thing that was chilling for me when I first witnessed ChatGPT was, oh my God, we've unleashed something that will have long range implications and changes in the system, but I don't know what those are. We'll only be able to discover them. Stephen Wolfram talks about, a lot of his computational stuff is looking at the computational irreducibility, right? Can you actually determine, can you come up with something that accurately predicts what will happen based on what you're doing here? We're getting into a place where it's fractal enough, its feedback is intricate enough that you can't. And so in an interview with him where he was asked about building the interface to allow ChatGPT to ask Wolfram Alpha questions, the first time that he did it, it was like, okay, what's going to happen? And the interviewer said, were you scared at that moment? Because, yeah, a bit. I'm handing the wheel over to something that I don't know what its full capacity is. I don't know how to predict what will happen in this scenario. And that we're in that situation where we're making choices that it's clear we don't understand the full implications of the choices we're making. That in and of itself. So I thought through this enough on my own that that metaphor rings true for me. There's something that is legitimate about that comparison of decreasing cognitive gravity to physical gravity as a metaphor for what happens and what possible implications of the systems for economics, for education, for healthcare, for all of these systems that have a certain kind of cognitive weight, pushback, inertia, that we've now changed the inertia of these systems. How does that come about? Will it change in a way that we understand? Another example, this is the one that I mentioned, even without AI. I recognize that working inside of companies, the kind of anxiety that employees bring with them every day, it's evident in their demeanor and the weight that they're carrying, that they don't know. There's questions that they're asking themselves they don't have the answers to, and no one has the answers to. There's kind of a dawning realization that there are no adults in the room who actually know what's going on, and yet a feeling of we can't actually acknowledge that. Like, the emperor has no clothes, and we don't want to mention it because we don't want to scare everybody. I mean, we are the emperor. We don't have any clothes. This moment. And the feeling of that, like noticing what the implication of that was noticing that decisions that I thought I could rely on were no longer reliable in the way that I thought. The impetus, the inclination that I had for how to steer the organization resulted in behavior that was strange and out of character for what I was expecting to happen. And the analogy there is it's very similar to somebody from Hawaii driving on ice for the first time, right? It's like, wait, I know how a car works. The conditions have changed so much that you don't know how a car works anymore. This is a new playground, right? We actually have to relearn the mechanics of this at scale. So that in and of itself, that qualifies for me as existential, because it, similar to the Bronze Age collapse, it can vastly, we already know how susceptible our supply chains are to collapse from just a virus, right? This is bigger than that by a lot. And we haven't yet hit a patch of black ice that sends us skidding noticeably, where we all reel back in horror, like, oh my God, I didn't know that was possible. I'll extend this just a bit in this kind of way that I'm looking at it. I love the fact that Barbie and Oppenheimer opened the same weekend, and there was a whole Barbenheimer meme about this. And I actually went to go see both movies, and there was something generative about seeing both these movies. One, spoiler alert, if you haven't seen Oppenheimer and you haven't read history, the notion that there was a moment in time where they didn't know whether or not detonating atomic device would create a chain reaction in the atmosphere. They weren't positive. They were reasonably sure. There was a chance. It was non-zero, but sufficiently close to zero that they thought there was no concern. But the movie, as Nolan lays it out, talks about something else. There's a political chain reaction that has been ignited and that is still ongoing. Our politics have changed dramatically because of this power dissimilarity. And we're still living with the ramifications for that. It's a much slower burn than if had the atmosphere caught fire. But we're still, in a way, on fire with that movement. And how to be responsible for that. I think Nolan does a good job. It's a little bit ham-fisted in some ways, but I think it is necessarily so. When Oppenheimer goes to Truman to try to express his concern, Truman's like, you silly man, you didn't pull the trigger, I did. Get lost. Don't let that crybaby back in my office again, right? What? Who's the crybaby? Like, this is astounding that we're at a point. I mean, this point, obviously something very interesting about the juxtaposition of this moment in AI and existential, and this moment in the past, which we now kind of accept, but is it really acceptable? There are generations that have been raised in the shadow of the mushroom cloud and atomic power that don't fully know what a world prior to that was like. And we still don't fully grasp it. There's some way that we take it for granted because it was already in the water when we were born, right? On the flip side, Barbie is kind of interesting as well, right? I watched, bemused. I'm actually thinking about making my own little thing here of Ben Shapiro's commentary on the Barbie Oppenheimer thing, where he spent 45 minutes trashing Barbie, and that the last sentence was, oh, Oppenheimer was a great movie, right? The movie that he described watching wasn't the movie that was on the screen. It was the movie that he imagined liberals wanted him to see. And there's something much deeper in that. Like, he claimed that this movie is for moms to take their 8-year-olds to be educated about what women's rights should look like. And I would say, no, this is moms, specifically, the character shows this, moms who were raised as 8-year-olds with a specific way of what they thought, coming into reality of, oh, fuck, what bargain did I make imagining some plastic world was possible? And how do I wake up from that nightmare to actually take control of the wheel again in order to steer my vehicle in a way that makes sense? So these two questions are very interesting in this moment in time. How do we wake up from the dream nightmare that seems to be in other people's hands, but seems to be no adults in the room, and become one of the adults participating and inviting other adults into the conversation. Those are the existential threads that I think deserve more spotlight and that are hard to bring forward because they're a little bit nuanced.
Let's see if I can work my way back there. Although I might have to sneeze.
All right.
Maybe. Maybe not.
I'll allow.
It always goes away when you call it out. I wrote this article on sincere irony, Barbie. And I like the Shapiro example because my argument was the film is critiquing the very thing that it's doing, which is setting you up to think that this is about the way society handles gender. And that's the layer of like meta critique that should be brought into this thing. Oppenheimer is a really interesting, I think, more explicit example of what you're talking about as the existential threat. I mean, whether or not Truman's terrible choice is the right choice or not, given all of history, we don't know. But in that moment, Oppenheimer represents the person who knows that the conditions have changed, and Truman is acting like you can make decisions based on the way the system has been. And what I hear you saying is that's the fundamental existential threat, is that the operating system has changed in a way. And if we keep acting like it hasn't, at some point that's going to be catastrophic. So we have to relearn, is what you said. But how do we do that? Like, what are the principles by which human beings can rapidly re-educate themselves about the current general situation and AI situation specifically?
Yeah, this is where I'll make a call back to earlier in the conversation about the commons, because I think that issues of how to mitigate existential risk and the commons are inextricably linked. They're fundamentally connected. And I would say that in some real way, what we have to come to grips with is the fact that it's no longer possible to externalize the costs of our mistakes, right? So when we say the big pharma is excluded from liability because vaccines are too expensive to actually be liable for, when we say we have to bail out the banks, when we acknowledge that we found a situation where it's too big to fail actually fits the equation, then what we're also determining is that too big to profit is also part of that equation. We can no longer pretend that too big to fail means you continue on what you want and we'll excuse you from everything. That's at a grand scale. At a local scale, how do I deal with that, right? And I know many people who are trying to change their diet. They're starting to recognize the food that I buy in the grocery store is trash. You know, my immune system is responding in poor ways. How do I deal with this? It becomes harder and harder to do that because the default is so much one way that I didn't choose, but I don't feel like I have the full agency to opt out of. I mean, opting out is a bigger challenge than I thought. I'm finding ways to do that, but more people need to find that way of opting out, and not opting out as in abandoning and leaving alone. But Bucky Fuller's notion of the way to change a system isn't to replace it, but to make it obsolete, create another one that makes the previous one obsolete. And that doesn't happen overnight. We can't flip the switch and just switch to the new one. It doesn't work that way. But what we can do is in small ways, start to recognize what that looks like and choices. I liked what Surya Foral said in I believe this is the first one of this series, right? There's a way that he's imagining a microcosm of wisdom cultivation that holds each other accountable. And I think that it acts as a good seed crystal for growing something larger. I like that part of it. I had a challenge. I was challenged a bit with the point that he made that similar to using GPS systems to navigate, people lose that capacity, and that's a necessary loss that we have to just accept. I don't accept that. I don't think that individual wisdom has to be relegated to the group because the group's more wise than I am and I don't have the capacity to recognize it. This kind of tuning the fork in the road teaches me the wisdom that I have, the wisdom that each individual has access to is much deeper. It's not obvious, but it's much deeper than we initially think. And so I think that probably is more in line with what he meant, but what I'm concerned that most audience members hear, what most listeners hear when they hear that, is a kind of movement towards totalitarian. You have to trust the collective, which we know from if you do that in a Borgish way, it's bad. But I'm part of the collective. I can't give up my voice that is part of the commons, right? It's no longer the commons if I do that. So the commons has to be regrown. A friend of mine just recently, I'm going to pause for just a second. There's a couple of things that I want to bring to mind, and I'll set it up a little bit. I have a friend whose wife has written a book called The Art of Alignment. And the alignment here speaks of alignment within an organization. What she noticed was most infighting in organizations is the same kind of infighting that happens on the internet at a different scale, right? It's talking past one another. And the talking past one another is difficult to kind of tell, why is that happening? And this is kind of the same thing as it lacks the basis of relationality that sees you and me as part, like we're arising because of the circumstance that we're creating. My concerns and values and the wounds that activate, my triggers and my ideas that I put forth are all based on this relationality that brings this forward, right? And then when I recognize that and not run from it, actually confront it, actually face it, something happens where I see you as a human being. This is a notion that Jordan Hall, Daniel Schmachtenberger talked about a while back with Rule Omega. Rule Omega is when you're speaking with someone you know is intelligent and they say something which you think is idiotic, suspend the impulse to cast them as an idiot and notice what is it. See, can you interact relationally in that moment rather than either orness? Can you tune the fork of this possibility of their thought stream and your thought stream to find the connection? That motion. Many years ago, I was at a talk where I heard Ray Kurzweil speaking at Stanford for the Accelerating Change Conference in 2005, and I heard Ray speaking. Been a fan of his for a while up to that. Really liked his thinking, but in something he said, it's like, oh, we have an opposable mind that's analogous to an opposable thumb. And the opposability is distinct from oppositionality. The oppositionality sees the other as an immovable force that I'm battling against, whereas the opposability sees the connection through the whole, through, in this case, the heart, that actually allows the fine-tuned grasping, the sense of affordances opening up because the connection is undeniable. It's invisible, but it's undeniable. I can feel it. It's where trust and faith goes whenever I actually sense into trusting the unseen, which is different from what scientists have often opposed this notion of faith when they said it's belief without evidence. Like there's evidence, but it's not the visual evidence. It's not the quantitative evidence that we're looking at. There's a qualitative evidence that I have to participate in order to interact. This kind of engaging the commons as this collective, as this from oppositionality to opposability, and feeling in the feedback loop of it awakens something that I think is more trustable and more explorable. It does a better job of actually sensing into the double bind that we find ourselves in and the profusion of portals and affordances that we were blind to when we only saw each other as obstacles to our goals.
It's a very interesting, to me, kind of parallel emergence of two things. And one of them is what I would call a new confidence among the philosophers. And John Vervaeke is a good example of a person who's looking at the negotiation of complementary forces as a means by which we individually and interpersonally are able to leverage our cognition to actual patterns in reality. And so the new confidence is philosophers, cognitive scientists saying, you know what? Reality actually is real, and we actually can know about it. And our ability to know about it is actually given to us through our knowing system. And there's been a lot of suspicion about that for the last 100 years. And so I'm sensing this new trust in our ability to actually make reliable contact with the real. But that's occurring at the same moment that digital tools are making information itself less reliable, and that AI type tools are going to accelerate that dramatically, it seems. At what point does all digital information seem extraordinarily unreliable, such that you just believe in it, or you're in some kind of suspicious recoil? So it's neat that this hugely emerging mistrust and this new sense of reliability are coming together.
Yes, absolutely. And I think it's essential, and I think it's important to recognize. There are lots of places where this starts to flower, and you can see it. Ian McGilchrist's work is pivotal in understanding this. And the holistic way of the right hemisphere symbolically representing the world, and the left hemisphere reductionistically representing the world, and the blind spots of that tendency, right, is important to actually look at. And I can't remember if I've talked to you about it, but I've rewritten the story of Adam and Eve in the Garden of Eden. It's a story that bothered me tremendously when I was a kid, because it just seemed wrong. Like, everything about it seemed wrong. And I just couldn't wrap my head around how God would set up a trap for us to fail and then punish us for doing so. It was like, that seems like a bad, I don't know. I don't trust a God who would do that, right? But in one evening when I was talking to friends, it came to me in a different way. Like, seeing it from a different perspective of Adam wanting to participate in the act of creation, asking for permission to do so, and God granting that permission with the caveat, be responsible for your actions, or this gift will turn into a nightmare. And upon first encountering the reaction to it, deep levels of resistance to accepting the responsibility of this agency had us turn away from responsibility for that. And the ball started rolling downhill. In a way, that story resonates with me much more deeply. In a way, I can see how that story makes sense prior to the fall, but doesn't make sense after the fall. In order for it to make sense after the fall, we have to look at, I'm responsible. I need to face my responsibility for the actions. I can't turn away from it. I can't hand it to anyone else. I can't blame it on previous generations or on certain people in power. I am the only one who can actually respond opposably, engagedly, in this in a way that wakes it up. That notion, like that's a kind of a new mythology, which a very gentle seed to turning around. Often what I notice in myself is the fear is I've gone the wrong direction for so long, right? Adam in that moment, turning away from the garden and running as fast as he could, similar to a cat with a bag stuck on its leg, afraid of its own fear, that it feels like I've been running this way so long. I mean, I have so much invested. There's no way to turn around and get back to the origin point. But I'm already here. All I need to do is turn around and face the thing that I'm afraid of, and I'm already back to the origin point. I never left. And that's a difficult thing to face, but it actually helps with the sense of, how can I turn into this and face what it is that I'm afraid of? And I think that we do ourselves a little bit of a disservice by invoking Moloch as an external force. I believe it's evolutionarily enacted within us. And it's the flip side of divinity. You can't separate the two. But which side we're exposed to is depending on which direction we're running, right? So that sense of it's intrinsic to me. And as horrifying as that is, it actually gives me the capacity to respond in a more generative way to that. That's the sense that I have, right? That's the hope that I have, that we can find another way to address these existential crises. That's the, I want to kind of go back and go through that in a different way. I did it in sort of a symbolic way, right? I did it in the way of a mythological retelling of that story. But when I think about it evolutionarily, the capacity that human beings had, and I again, this is broad. I'm gonna express it in a small little nugget, but it's taken a while for this to kind of come about. The notion of the first tools, stone tools that human beings, that our species and predecessors, it was before our species. We developed tools before there were Homo sapiens, right? That indicates likelihood that tools gave rise to Homo sapiens. But the tools that were created, the hand axe, the chipping the stone, the chipping away and exposing an edge that could be used as a tool, was potent. A surprising discovery was that there were many of these hand axes that were in pristine condition. They did not get used as tools. They could see that in the same encampment where they found other fragments that had been chipped off, they did get used as tools. What was this thing that looks perfectly suited as a tool, but doesn't get used as a tool? And a hypothesis is it's jewelry, it's a symbol, it's an actual icon for skill. It does something. But there's something interesting about this as well. It persisted in that basic form for almost 2 million years. For almost the entire time, there was little variation around the world of species. I mean, our ancestors making the same hand axe over and over and over and over again. And it wasn't until about 100,000 years ago that we started to see a profusion of diversity, of like putting these on spearheads and arrow points, right? So we found ways to do that. Also, at some point in that time, fire was discovered, right? There's something, if you're chipping flint, you're going to see sparks. So at some point, hundreds of thousands of years of doing this carving and doing something, it's possible that you discover the connection there. This ability to unleash hidden powers within the stones, within the fire, these things that then give us the capacity to build and refine our tools through agriculture and language and technology. And then discovering that there are hidden reserves of power within the earth that we can use to power this whole thing, and economies built on top of that. It's easy to see how we move in this direction. And in some sense, the reductionist path had enough fuel to keep that direction going for a long time. But the further we went along that, the harder it was to look back to actually trusting our interior sense, our intuition. And we're now at a point where the fork in the road that we must tune is, do we double down and go another round? Or do we retune the past that's come this far and look at, I can't survive if I kill the ecosystem. It is inherently part of me. I have to respond as if this opposability is Earth and me, our species and all the rest of the species together. And so that inspires me. That story, that possibility feels true enough to be a starting point for telling that story again and inviting others to participate in the kind of opposable change-making, commons voicing interaction that allows us to attenuate the existential nature of our thing and say, I think we actually can respond, but not through blind hope, through an actual engaged hope that is paying attention to the feedback loops of what's working and what's not working. And this is part of where it's really important to pay attention to the transparency. If the transparency is hidden from me, if it's made opaque, what's happening, there's no way that I can see which of the actions are having which impacts. I have to see that.
Got two tangents and a question. The first tangent is based on it, and I love this idea of scientific reductionism as the standardized axe. The sense of a pristine unused tool, it just triggers a thing from this week for me because I was watching a documentary on this remote island off the coast of the Andaman Islands that's protected from the civilized world, and there's these sort of unseen tribal people who've often killed those who came on the beach. And there was an Indian anthropologist who would drop off gift packages for years trying to thaw the situation. And they were there in a boat and they dropped off a pig and a stuffed teddy bear and a set of pots and pans and some coconuts. And then these young men came out and danced around, threw spears, struck the cameraman, stabbed the pig, stabbed the teddy bear, buried both in the sand, and retreated into the woods with the coconuts and the cookware. And I've been wondering what became of the cookware. Are they cooking with it, or is it just on an altar somewhere as the pristine, unused tool?
Exactly. It's so beautiful.
The other tangent is I listened to that link you sent of the guy going through Forrest Landry's metaphysics and orienting around this notion that the liminal community could, let's say, be the tip of the spear in caring for Moloch in a certain way. That was really beautiful.
Yeah. So David,
Adam
his name is David Rugg.
Yeah.
Project Liminality is the thing that he's doing, and the YouTube video is the Age of Miracles. So recommend that for anybody else who's interested in that topic.
Yeah, it was really compelling. And each little bit he did was pregnant with potential, and this delightful little music between each of his comments. Your Adam and Eve thing. That's where I want to go with the question. It's it seems like we have a reluctance to go through negative affect, even if that's only a veil to a more reliable mode of being, right? That in order to be responsible users, we have to be able physiologically even to confront the sensations of having been misguided or off course or insufficient, things like that. And when I look at the popular response to AI, there's the naive optimists who feel like we've seen this before, it's completely manageable, it's just going to make things better, we know how to handle this, and the doom-oriented naysayers who think it's catastrophic. There's something I like about the catastrophic people, which is I see them trying to process a negative feeling, maybe to get to the other side, but I don't see them succeeding in processing that negativity. What do you think's holding them up there? Why is that not turning into a renewed sense of responsibility? They're touching it, they're feeling it, they're seeing the bad feeling, the grief we have to go through. Why aren't they getting through it?
This is a beautiful question, and I have a fairly helpful answer for me. I'll see how it lands for you and others, but I'm going to again go to Nora Bateson, who quotes what's his name? Edward Korzybski, right? Korzybski is his last name. I'm thinking Edward's his first name. But anyway, Alfred Korzybski, and don't mistake the map and the territory, right? There's something evolutionarily advantageous for us finding a really good map, and something very expensive about us ignoring that, right? So when we find a good map, we hold on to it. This is evident in my own personal growth, watching the way that I do this. Like, one of the things that I recognized, to my horror, was the degree to which my psychology and my personality was informed by a sense of resentment that ran through all of my relationships. I think of myself, I'm Enneagram 9, so the peacemaker. I think of myself as a very loving, hopeful, optimistic person, but I hide my derision of others' incapacity to meet the challenge, even from myself. And there's a kind of weirdly, a kind of comfort that I derive from that. It was really hard for me to actually unpack that and recognize I have outgrown the utility of this thing. And yet it's an addiction. I have to actually fully encounter the cost of that notion. And it's deeply woven into this thing of like the rule omega, the capacity to actually listen generatively to those who I disagree with most deeply, to tune the fork in the road. That relaxes in a sense, the response that I get, the homeostasis that I'm afforded by having that worldview is comforting over the option, the alternative of uncertainty. This thing is reliable, but bad. This is uncertain, and I have no idea what it holds. I'll take the monster I know, right? And I can see myself doing that. So I'm curious how that lands for you. There's something in that at first seems like, wait, is that plausible? Am I really holding on to the bad part of it? Well, pay attention to yourself, but then scale it up to the level of civilization. Pay attention to the fact that we use cell phones that we know are mining materials that enslave people and create damage to the environment and the peoples who are mining it. And we kind of say, oh, well, it's necessary. That we're embracing something. That whole act of externalizing the cost of this activity is a devil's bargain. It is what Moloch does. And there's something in it, there's a place for parasites. There's a place for finding a way to exploit unused energy, right? But to the extent that we've expanded that capacity to factory farms and how, demolishing ecosystems, can we actually afford to continue to pay that price? And what has us rationalize and justify that behavior? It's a map that works. It's a kind of familiarity. And it's easier to accept when it's somebody else paying the price than it is for me. But I think that what's coming up, and I use Maui as an example. We're not able to avoid this anymore. This is coming for us. Like the collapse of the infrastructure, this Jenga tower that we built so tall, this Tower of Babel is teetering and tottering, and it can't work on pure physics in this reductionist way. It has to work on relationality. And again, this opposability gives a relationality that looks like the geodesic dome. Back to Bucky Fuller, that sense of the support and structure spreads the stress in such a way that it's distributed across the whole surface, and each point in it is actually responding to the local stress, not to the decentralized faraway stressor, the far away piece of that stress that I can't actually encounter. I only have rumor of what that's like at that juncture point. So let me see. Can I actually make my way back to the question that you asked? What did you ask?
Why aren't the doomsayers actually processing the bad feeling that needs to be processed to move into a better position on these things? Because they are encountering it.
Yes. There is a weird kind of, I think that if we pay attention to it, a weird, strange pleasure that we derive from the rightness of our conclusion. I recognized it in myself early on when I noticed that there was a righteous indignation. I know what's better and everybody else is stupid. This is that pre-Rule Omega kind of a thing. And there's something of the strange satisfaction that I have of telling myself that I'm smarter and better than everybody else. And when I actually release that, I do go into an unknown. I let go of an anchor point that gives a kind of certainty into an unknown where I really don't know. And in a sense, that's what we're putting in for the existential fear that we have, right? Is the unknown. No one actually knows what the end of this looks like. And so there's something that wants to resolve that unknown. And the only way to actually resolve that unknown is to encounter it openly with wide eyes, open eyes, looking at what's actually here.
Yeah, there's I like that. And we do see these patterns of stasis and addiction in individual lives where we prefer a certain kind of distress to other possible kinds of distress. And we tend to keep that going until it absolutely collapses, right? Like Mao is a good example. This is the best we can do, provided we don't change any fundamental things. And we're going to keep doing that general solution set until something forces us not to. Problem is, everything can be wrecked by the time that's the case. So, how do we simulate the catastrophe in ourselves? How do we sort of amplify or spike the unpleasantness a little bit to make it begin to move? I think that's an open question. I like the question about the uncertainty as well, because when you know that we're doomed and should be afraid, you also get to be the satisfied knower of that certain fact.
Yeah.
Which is a lot more comforting in some ways emotionally than just having no bloody idea what's going on.
Yes. Yes. I want to name one other thing here that kind of ties these things together interestingly, because part of the how do we do the commons is a big question, and I don't have the answer for it. Like I said, I think that voice of the commons is probably a good starting point, but I don't know. And I've tried to find what else makes sense there. There's something with governance, but there's something of feedback and reflection, the ability to engage, transparency, right? These things are all important. One of the friends that I have developed something, noticing we're in a kairos moment, right? We're in a moment where the change is pregnant. Ilya Prigogine was saying that, when you find a system that is a complex system that's far from equilibrium, there are pockets of instability which can give rise to a shifting the whole system, right? And this kairos kind of has that potential. This kairotic moment has that potential. Kairotic flow is a model that looks at archetypes from a perspective of what is the certainty. Like in some sense, you can kind of lay this on top of left brain reductionist mindset and right brain more generative, expansive, and symbolic mindset. On the one hand, the inspiration from this came from Simon Wardley, and Simon Wardley has a map that he uses, initially naming it the archetypes, the three archetypes of pioneer, settler, and town planner. And people have a problem with that because of the colonial implications, but I think the colonial implications are actually perfect for that side of this larger flow, because they do have a kind of extract and repeat, extract, rinse, and repeat kind of model of this externalization of the cost that is fueled by petroleum and all sorts of other technology. And we sort of short circuit the full cycle that goes into the kairotic side of the underground part, where we have to rely on the intrinsic nature of, she named them steward, curator, and scout. And part of the reason that I name this, and I think it's important, I have optimism that we can use AI to help discover possibilities. I can see potential exploration points that I missed. Watching it play Go, watching it play chess, it's evident to me that it can show me things that are worth exploring, not to say that it's found the best option, but it can wake up possibilities that may stimulate me to think of other possibilities that I didn't see before. So I think that it can be generative in that kind of back and forth with it to discover, what does the landscape look like? And where's my bias preventing me? Where's my avoidance of responsibility? My clinging tight to doomsday keep preventing me from saying, oh, wait, hold on. What about this right over here? It just looks like there's a possibility of doing something a little bit different, and then expanding on that and looking out further. But my friend has, Kylie Stedman, and Kylie Stedman Gomez, has a sense of that AI can't be used responsibly. And one of the things we're looking at, we talk weekly and we kind of engage in this a bit. One of the things that she intuits, and I think is valid, is that scouting is the least reliable place. If we trust the answers that AI gives us, scouting is the place where we can't actually engage it. We actually need to encounter the wild in order to find what these points are. So I can't delegate scouting to AI. That's a place where I absolutely can't do that from her perspective. And I see the wisdom of that. Like, need to be extremely careful about having it propose solutions to these existential crises, right? Not the right move. But there is something I self-identify as more aligned with the curator role, and that's kind of paying attention to the curation, like retelling the mythology, like repurposing the mythology, composting what we have been given and got us to this point, to look at it, overturn it, and look at where do we go from here. That feeds into the scouting of, okay, what possible things do we look at? Now that I've sort of seen the underside of this, how can I see something that's beneficial that will feed us? How can I stop climbing this one hill, cross the valley to some other hills, and discover what's out there, what's on the horizon? How do I navigate this unknown? To some extent, that pioneer settler town planner part of it wants to keep it over there because it feels more controlled. It's the kind of addiction to certainty that we can afford whatever calamity comes of this next iteration of the doubling down. And if you actually look at the mechanics and the reality of it, it's difficult to justify that. I'll give one example of this to pay attention to that I don't think I'd heard elsewhere, and I don't think is well known and possibly disputed. So I take this with a grain of salt. But Daniel Schmachtenberger was having a conversation with Nate Higgins, and they were talking about the possibility of finding alternative fuels, alternative energy sources for fossil fuels. One of the things that Nate Higgins, who studies this deeply, claims is that in 2022, the increase in demand for power surpassed all generation of power by every form of alternative energy up to that point. We're even with the possibility that we're going to be able to do that. Now, it's possible that solar will be exponential in a way that we can grow faster than the curve of depletion or expansion of the demand for energy. But when you see that, it's not trivial. We're not almost there. And I don't know that we have a chart that shows the exponential curve and where that intersects, that we actually cross over into sustainability or wise choice making about that. So this hunger that we can afford the technology to get us past that point. Maybe not. It's very deeply uncertain. And I don't like the odds, given that we're not deeply actually looking at it. If we do like Truman, take that crybaby out and let it back into my office, then we are sealing the fate of our own existential calamity, right?
There's something I really resonate with about that argument that these we can't defer our scouting to these tools, these assistants, these other scouts. Connects in my mind with Nassim Taleb's critiques that dovetail nicely with McGilchrist, that are instantiated external and internal model-making systems run a form of intelligence that's quite distinct from what our overall organism does when it has skin in the game. And if we rely on things to show us what the patterns might be, we're going to fundamentally misunderstand those patterns. So that's a powerful argument. But in my mind, there's someone that mediates between the pioneer and the settler, right? There's the shaman figure who's a settled pioneer or a pioneer settler or something like that, who within the settlement constantly goes to have embodied personal deepening communication with the things that have been revealed in the search space. And I think if we had more competence in that area, we might be able to make that sequence a little bit more reliable. Now we're at 90 minutes, so we're in the area where my pleasure in talking to you runs up against my suspicion that people can't track any more information.
I think
is that place. Yeah.
I will say
where we are, or is anything last you want to bring into this before we go?
I'll add one piece here with the. I want to name that there's a caution with the notion of the kairotic flow and the way of looking at these archetypes. That these archetypes aren't personas. They're not roles. Don't I want to avoid some of the problem that a lot of people fell into with Ken Wilber integral and spiral dynamics of saying, oh, you're red or you're green. Oh, you're a settler or a town planner. It's like, that's an ineffectual way to actually consider that. Two things happen. One is there is a tendency of a kind of a role where I feel most comfortable. And I can act in several roles, but I prefer one. That's one aspect. There's another aspect, which is not the role, but the phase of the project that we're in. And I actually think that this looks a little bit like the notion of flow genome that Jamie Wheel has put forth in Stealing Fire, that the flow genome has a kind of a motion through it, and this full expression of it has a way of not just doing the reductionist algorithmic rinse and repeat model, but going into the unknown and finding new territory to bring back. That this notion is that the phase that we're in, the reason we're in a Kairos moment isn't because everyone is a settler or a town planner or a scout. It's because the tipping point, the challenge of continuing on where we've come from and where we're going from is so unstable that it's unlikely we're going to make another doubling down effort work well. So it's like, take those models and play with them loosely and feel them more generatively than simply assigning a cause and effect kind of assignment to those archetypes.
When I look around, I definitely see that the expand the search space function seems to be characteristic of this moment, whether it's the renewed openness to intuitive and divinatory systems in advanced thought communities, whether it's and I was at the Denver Psychedelics Conference, the almost industrial production of new psychedelics that have never been seen on this planet before, to the AI tools and the things they will produce as they merge with other technologies, or all of Wolfram's stuff about the vast rouliad of incomprehensible computational patterns. All of this seems to be a moment of extraordinary explosion in the search space of the patterns that are possible, partly in response to our ability to create those new search spaces, and partly in response to our sense that the patterns we already have are not resolving our convergent crises.
Yeah, beautiful. Yeah, no, that's very much true. I think if there was a time to really honor the fact that our hubris is dangerous, like now, pay attention, really tune in to that. What is mine to do? What is there I'm being invited to? How do I respond to that invitation? How do I be responsible and accountable, not to some goal that someone else set for me, but to what divinity informs me is actually mine to do.